see is Eurasia. It's based on what I was just discussing, this idea of linking Europe and the Pacific through high-speed rail connections and through development corridors, not just connecting the two ends, but using that as a basis for developing nuclear-powered cities, water projects, energy products, industrial cities along the way, uplifting Central Asia and rebuilding the Russian Far East, as well as expanding trade and collaboration internationally. Now, this was based on a principle that's not new. Go to the third slide. This is Gottfried Leibniz, the great German philosopher, scientist, economist from the 17th and 18th century, who in a sense is the mentor of Mr. LaRouche. And he was in collaboration with the Jesuit missionaries who were in China at the time and began a publication called Novissima Sinica, the news from China in Europe, in which he said, and I'll read what's on the screen there, he said, "I consider it a singular plan of the fates that human cultivation and refinement should today be concentrated, as it were, in the two extremes of our continent, in Europe and in China, which adorns the Orient as Europe does the opposite edge of the earth. Perhaps supreme providence has ordained such an arrangement so that as the most cultivated and distant people stretch out their arms to each other, those in between may gradually be brought to a better way of life." This is precisely the idea that is in effect the basis of sovereign nation states as developed at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. It's the idea of the interest of the other as being one's own interest. And that concept of uplifting the world as a whole through development is the basis on which we proceed with this effort to deal with this current crisis. Now go on to the fourth slide. This is the map of that's in the current special report. I think you have copies of it there. I hope you do. The back cover of that report has the map that I'm showing you on the screen. There's two aspects to what we're going through in this Landbridge idea, the Silk Road idea. One is the corridors that I've described, the other being links, linking parts of the world that have not been linked in the past. And I want to just quickly review a few of them while we're looking at that large map. The first is the Bering Strait, and somebody there might want to point them out in the map if it's convenient. The idea of building a tunnel under the Bering Strait, connecting the United States and Russia, has been around for a very long time, but it became a very serious effort in the 1990s. The Russians called a conference in Moscow on building a tunnel under the Bering Strait. Mr. LaRouche gave a keynote speech at that conference. He's seen as the architect of this concept of the global land bridge, and in particular, linking the United States and Russia by rail. And at that conference, Mr. Putin said that this is a war avoidance policy, because the effort to demonize Russia at that time was already beginning in a serious way. And he said, correctly, that were we to work with the United States on our actual mutual self-interests and the development of the entire Russian Far East and the Alaska, Canada area that now is vastly underdeveloped, this would be a basis for overcoming the kind of manipulated antagonisms and so-called contradictions between them. Now, if you take the rail connection from the United States up to the Bering Strait, which of course would mean developing that entire region through this development corridor idea, and follow that down south through Mexico, through Central America, you're going to come to what's called the Darien Gap. And this is a stretch of about 100 kilometers in Colombia, which is marshland and which has never been connected by either road or rail. And it's, again, something that's been on the board for a long time. It's now imminently feasible, and it's a basis on which we can and must connect the North and South American continents, so that you could actually take a rail from the southern tip of Argentina, through South America, through Central America, through the United States, through Canada, to Alaska, to Russia, to China, to Europe, to the Middle East, into Africa, and down to the tip of Africa when we succeed in building the necessary railroads in Africa. So these are the kind of great projects that we're talking about. Now, there's many more. I'm not going to go through them now for a matter of time. But for instance, we could connect Japan to the mainland both through bridges that go from northern Japan into the Sakhalin Islands and across from the Sakhalin Island to the mainland Russia. We could connect Japan to Korea on the southern tip of Japan. This would integrate Japan directly into the Eurasian development, facilitating Japan, Korea, China, Russia, and Mongolia working together on the development of the Russian Far East and the Tumen River area, the Yalu River area, which is one of the things we cover in the report at some length as not only absolutely essential and valuable, but something which is really the only way of ending the crisis with North Korea and giving North Korea a stake in rail and oil development in that region. This is now being pursued by South Korea and Russia, and to a certain extent with China involved. There's also, in Europe, we could and must build a tunnel under the Mediterranean connecting Spain and Tunisia as a basis of bringing Northern Africa and Europe together through rail. So these are the kind of links that are possible. In terms of the development corridors, we know about the Silk Road. You see the Silk Road process there on the maps. If you look at the blue line, that's known as what Xi Jinping called for as the Maritime Silk Road. Reopening the path that was taken by the great 14th and 15th century Chinese admiral Cheng He, who had the great treasure ships at the time of Columbus, but ships that were 3 times bigger than anything Columbus had in discovering America, which were traveling through the Malacca Straits, into the Indian Ocean, into the Persian Gulf, down the coast of Africa to Madagascar. And Xi Jinping, in his speech in Indonesia last year, proposed reopening this maritime Silk Road. He met with Dr. Mahathir in Malaysia, and they formed the Cheng He Foundation to foster this idea of the Maritime Silk Road. And China has allotted an extra $20 billion fund for that development, along with their $40 billion fund for the Silk Road in Central Asia, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank $100 billion fund, along with the BRICS New Development Bank, which is another $100 billion. And you begin to see that we're talking about very serious means of launching these development projects on a global scale, which have been rejected and refused to be financed by the IMF and the World Bank increasingly over this last period. So go to the 5th slide. These are the BRICS leaders. This was their meeting in Australia on the sideline of the G20 meeting. And this, I think you see the enthusiasm in their faces in terms of what they're putting together. This is not trying to exclude the United States. It's not a counter to the IMF and the World Bank. It basically is a response to the fact that the IMF has refused to reform itself and allow a voice for what are now some of the most powerful economies in the world, and that it has increasingly imposed conditions on any lending such that most countries don't get infrastructure of any sort. Their policies in Africa have tended to be that we don't want to invest in infrastructure, we don't want to build true nations, but rather we'll help the poorest, we'll help the small farmer, but we won't build infrastructure, we won't build irrigation, we won't build railroads, which is another way of saying we're going to keep small farmers as small farmers rather than actually developing true industrial nations in the developing sector. Now, how are we going to fuel this? This is an extremely important part. Go to the 6th slide. Well, actually, rather than reading that slide, the pamphlet, which I'm sure we have there, or maybe not, you may not, we just started a pamphlet as well, issued a pamphlet. You may not have it there. Here is a picture of it with that same picture of the BRICS nations. It's called Why the United States Must Join the BRICS, a New International Order for Mankind. But one of the graphs they have in here was actually better than the one I have on the screen, which shows what we mean by energy flux density. It asks the question, what amount of fuel do you need to be the equivalent of a tank of gas? If you're burning wood, you need 300 pounds. If you're burning coal, you need 200 pounds. If you're burning gas, you need 16 gallons. If you're doing nuclear fuel, you need 1 paperclip worth of fuel. If you use deuterium-tritium fusion reactions, you need the equivalent of a grain of rice of fuel. And if you go on to matter-antimatter reactions, which we will someday in the future, it would be the equivalent of what they call a flea egg. And this captures the idea of energy flux density, which is a concept which LaRouche has developed, but which captures really the whole history and progress of mankind. That as it starts with the Promethean myth, when Prometheus decided to defy the gods of Olympus, Zeus and the gods of Olympus, who wanted to treat, which were really another name for the oligarchs of the day, who wanted to keep the human race backwards, who wanted to perhaps even let them become extinct, but to treat them as animals. And Prometheus said no, and he gave man the gift of fire. And with the gift of fire, man was able to use the creative power of the human mind, which distinguished him from the animals, and to begin to develop technologies, to build machines. And as he learned more of mastered the laws of the universe and built machines, he was able to turn something that was just an oily, dirty substance that was ruining their farmland, called oil, that suddenly was transformed into an extremely valuable resource. And as we mastered the science of the atom, we were able to unlock the tremendous power which we didn't even know was there in the atomic structures. And it's in this way that you refute the whole green environmentalist idea that we somehow have limited resources. We don't have limited resources. It's the development of the human mind, the use of fire, fire in the form of nuclear and fusion today, that you overcome limitations of limited resources by redefining what becomes a resource. And I'll mention later, for fusion, which we must reach, and we would have been at fusion already if we had followed John Kennedy's plan. But we must get fusion online within the next 30 years or so. And when we do, that one of the most valuable fuels for fusion is helium-3, which is very scarce on the Earth, but which is very plentiful on the moon. And the U.S., during the days when we were going to the moon, were talking about mining helium-3. We, of course, no longer do that in the United States. We don't have a manned space program. But this is precisely what the Chinese are doing. They're planning on their series of moonshots to mine helium-3, to bring it back here to fuel fusion reactions, to essentially provide power for mankind for thousands of years. And that is the basis upon which this has to move forward. Now, in the meantime, we have to have nuclear power. Lots and lots of nuclear power. Go to the next slide. This is a quote from the first part of the article by our associate Ramtanu Maitra, who was an Indian nuclear engineer who has worked with us for many years. And what he writes at the beginning of that article is more than 1.2 billion people, more than 20% of the world's population, are today without access to electricity. Almost all of them live in developing countries. This includes 550 million in Africa and more than 400 million in India. It is incumbent on all world leaders to bring this number to zero at the earliest possible date, and thus provide all people with a future to look forward to within a span of 25 years. Can this be done with fossil fuels, wind, and solar power? The answer is a resounding no. Now, I'll point out that Mr. Putin is in India today, meeting with this extraordinary new leader in India, Mr. Modi. And what they agreed to already is that Russia will build 12 nuclear power plants for the Indians, who themselves are building their own nuclear reactors and are moving on towards developing other kinds of nuclear reactors, which they're rather unique in their development. And there's a talk about building 24 new nuclear reactors. Modi has committed to cleaning up India. He's committed to building 100 new cities across India, modern cities, which of course will require this kind of power that cannot be done. You cannot maintain an expanding population with the existing fuel sources. It must be done by nuclear with the intent of having fusion online by that time. As Helga LaRouche said in her recent presentation in Washington, Modi's building 100 cities. Don't you think we could get the U.S. to build 1 or 2? But, you know, this is the reality. This nation is shutting itself down while the world is leaping forward. Now, besides the power, and by the way, he proves in that article that we need to build 5,000 nuclear power plants worldwide within the next 30 to 40 years, at about 200 per year. And the only thing holding us back from that is that we don't have the capacity to produce that many right now because our nuclear industry has been destroyed. The U.S. can no longer build a nuclear plant. We have to buy the containment vessels from Japan, and Japan is shutting down its nuclear industry. We have a chapter in the report on why Japan must return to nuclear, not only for its own benefit, but for the world, because they have a very powerful nuclear industry capacity. So the other thing is water. Go to the 9th slide, the next slide. This is a picture of the deserts. Of course, a lot of the desert is the Middle East deserts. Mr. LaRouche, back in the 1980s, had a proposal for what's called the Oasis Plan. It was how to deal with the water crisis in the Middle East, where water is actually more valuable than oil. And it has to do with building canals from the Red to the Dead Sea. It has to do with building, filling in the Qatar Depression in Egypt, and massive desalination programs, nuclear-driven desalination plants. I won't go through that now. We have it upgraded. It's in the report. But I want to look at 2 desert areas that show a very stark contrast. One is the Gobi Desert in China, and the other is the so-called Great American Desert, which is in the U.S. Southwest and northern Mexico. Now, look at the next slide. This is NWAPA, the North American Water and Power Alliance. This was a project developed in the 1950s by the Parsons Company. It was ready to go. John Kennedy wanted to build NWAPA. This was going to bring significant portions of the wasted water from Alaska that drains off into the Arctic and into the Pacific, to take a portion of that, to divert it down south, put it through the Rocky Mountain Trench, and basically transform this Great American Desert in America and northern Mexico into agricultural land. It would have doubled the agricultural land in the United States. It would have been the greatest infrastructure program in the history of mankind. There's much I could say about it, but it didn't happen. When Kennedy was killed, we lost the space program, we ended up going to a colonial war, and we lost NWAPA. The result, I think, is stark and clear. We are now watching the state of California and the state of Texas, and to a certain extent, Arizona, Nevada, and others, being absolutely destroyed, because there's no water. And we're in the midst of a drought which is going to continue, because the drought is not caused by global warming, it's caused by galactic phenomena, and it's going to continue. We already have 20% of California's farms have been shut down for lack of water. Our beef herds in Texas are now at the level they were in 1951, with half again more people, or more, because there's no water. We have ghost towns popping up all over. Las Vegas, the capital of gambling and perversity. It's going to be a ghost town. There's no water. They can't sustain it. And we didn't build the project that would have solved that problem. It's now too late. We can't start NWAPA and solve this problem. We need vast emergency measures, nuclear-powered desalination, and we're experimenting. Various scientists are looking at ways of dealing with the water in the atmosphere, but it's going to require new scientific technologies to deal with this devastating collapse that's taking place in the south of the United States, southwest. Now, go to the next slide. This is China. About the same time we were rejecting Nawapa, the Chinese were dealing with the problem of not only the desert, but also the extremely dry north generally, the lack of water for Beijing and the northern cities, and for the agriculture in the north. But they did do what they had to do. They began one of what is in fact the greatest water project ever undertaken by mankind, moving huge quantities of water from the south, which has plentiful water, from the Yangtze region, up to the north, to the Yellow River region. And that is now functioning. There were three plans, one on the east, essentially along the route of the old Grand Canal, one in central China, and one out in the far west. The first two are now functioning. This year, they began delivering water to the north. And this is a very serious issue, but it's been solved because they took on the responsibility of addressing the future. The two connections out in the Yangtze River base, the route of the river, moving it up to the Yellow River, those are now under construction. But the first two are functioning, they're working. And I think it demonstrates the kind of impulse that we have to join if we're going to get out of this crisis. Now, to look at the Silk Road, look at the next slide. This is a picture of China's rail and water projects. Not today, but back in 1919, which never got built. But this was Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Chinese Republic, who had been educated in Hawaii by Americans connected to the Abraham Lincoln School, Henry Carey's School of Economy. He learned about Alexander Hamilton. He learned about, in fact, he went back and organized the revolution in China based on American system principles, quite consciously. He writes about it. His three principles of the people are based on Abraham Lincoln's idea of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And this was his plan in 1919 to build a grid of rail and water projects across China using the resources that had been wasted in World War I, he said. If you want to prevent war, use the resources that were being wasted on war to build China and build the developing sector this way. Well, it didn't happen. It's a long story. But it is happening now. Look at the next slide. This is a slide of the existing rail in China. The blue lines, if you can see it there, are high-speed rail. China will soon have 18,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. The United States has 0. Canada, 0. Mexico, 0. North and South America, 0. We were going to build a high-speed rail in Florida in the 1990s. It was ready to go, actually. And then a guy got elected governor by the name of Jeb Bush, one of the Bush League crowd. And his first act as governor was to shut down the high-speed rail in Florida, canceled it. The legislature there rebelled and put a ballot on the ballot to vote, and won the vote, demanding, basically changing the state constitution, demanding that the high-speed rail be constructed. And then Bush, as governor, vetoed the funding bills. So it never happened. So this is the tradition of Prescott Bush and the Bush family, who were the supporters of Hitler's rise to power. And it's continuing today. Larry Summers, the man who helped destroy the U.S. and European economies with his policies, just the other day said, we shouldn't be wasting money on fancy high-speed rail and things. We should just fix up what we've got. Don't waste money on the future. And Obama, this is like Obama's statement about a couple years ago, saying we don't need any fancy fusion or something. We can just go with solar power. So this is the mentality which has brought this nation to the crisis that we're now facing, a devastating crisis, a genocidal crisis, I would add. Now, in China, look at the next slide. This is Xinjiang. You hear about Xinjiang. This is where you hear often about the Uyghur terrorism, which is emerging now under the training of Al-Qaeda. And you hear about Chinese repression of the Uyghur people. You don't hear about the massive development taking place in the region, uplifting the standard of living of all people, Han and Uyghur. But what is extraordinary is that they've built 3 high-speed rail connections into Xinjiang, into the cities of Urumqi and Kashgar. And they're not just stopping there. These are then going to be the jumping off point, the hub for the Silk Road in Central Asia. Go to the next slide. This is their plan for rail in Central Asia. A lot of this has been built already, and some of it is in process. But it might be a little hard to see. But this is Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and these rail connections will, in fact, and along with pipelines, build these entire regions economically, and of course shoot off into Europe, down into the Middle East, down through Pakistan to the Indian Ocean, and most importantly, down into Afghanistan. Both the Chinese and the Russians are very, very concerned about what's going to happen in Afghanistan as the U.S. pulls out. Under NATO occupation, that country was turned into the greatest opium producer in the history of mankind. It's what Viktor Ivanov, the drug czar in Russia, declared as the Second British Opium War, this time mostly against Russia and the Eastern European countries, as well as China and others. But this massive drug production and the terrorist networks in this region are, of course, they have not been suppressed. They're still there. And neither Russia nor China wants to allow a return of the so-called Great Game with the competition over Central Asia. And the only way to prevent that is by real development. So their plan, and they don't want to be in conflict on this, so they're, even though people in the West would like to have them be in conflict, because this was previously part of the Soviet Union, but they are very committed, Putin and Xi Jinping, to work together to make sure that there's collaboration on building this region, eliminating the drug scourge, taking on the terrorist thing the way it must be, and proceeding from that line. Now, if you look at Russia's view, look at the next slide. Well, this is Russia's rail plan. I can skip by that now. It's a huge plan. They have rail, and you can see the connection there from the Trans-Siberian up to the Bering Strait. They've already begun building that connection, even though there's, of course, no agreement from the U.S. to do it. But the Russian vision is that we're going to start building this right now. Go to the next slide, though. And this is Russia's plan for Central Asia. Our friend in Russia, Yuri Krupnov, has this plan, taking the science center in Siberia around Novosibirsk, taking that scientific capacity and extending it south through Central Asia, building secondary industries in Kazakhstan and in the Stans, and then tertiary industries in Afghanistan. And again, this is being done in collaboration with China's new Silk Road economic belt as a basis for truly collaborating on dealing with the areas that are still a very serious strategic threat to the entire world. Now, look at the next slide. This slide of Africa, I think this captures the difference between European colonialism and what the BRICS nations are doing in a way which is very stark. On the left, you see the existing rail lines in Africa. It looks like you have a bunch of knives sticking into the continent. And the reason for that was that the colonial powers were only interested in building railroads that could go into the mines and bring out the raw materials. Now, of course, China needs raw materials, no question. So this is not to their self-interest to develop Africa. But unlike the West, they're going to pay for the raw materials. Not with money that's going to sit in their bank and really just be a form of debt and debt slavery, but rather with infrastructure, actually building industrial nations. What you see on the right is the plan for the development of Africa's rail. When Li Keqiang, the premier of China, was there this year, he said, we are going to build high-speed rail connecting every capital of Africa. They're now already planning the building of a cross-continental railroad from Dakar in Senegal to Djibouti. And they might be building a second one. This is a process of building true nations who can be friends and partners through development. Again, an idea that used to be known as the American system. It's what Roosevelt imagined would happen after the war if he hadn't died, and if a puppet Truman under British influence had not taken over and basically helped the Europeans back into their colonies. So look at the next slide, which is South America. Basically the same thing. China is now building a rail connection from Peru to Brazil, the first cross-continental rail there. Our organization published a book called The United States of Ibero-America back in the 1980s, proposing precisely this kind of process. It's now being carried out by the BRICS, not by the United States, although we must get the United States in on this process. So, the question everybody asks often is, oh, well, yeah, that's all fine and good, but how are you going to pay for it? We can't pay for it. We're in a global economic crisis, and so forth. Look at the next picture. That's Alexander Hamilton, who was the founder of the American system, and who, what most people don't know, including Americans, is that he founded a system different from monetarism. That the monetary policy of the European parliaments and kingdoms and so forth was rejected by the founding fathers, and he discovered, literally discovered, a concept known as the creditary system of economics, where you did not borrow money from the private banking system in order to have government investment. You generated credit, but that it had to be tied to the concept of a national bank which would give credit with strings attached that only went into the necessary forms of industry, agriculture, schools and hospitals, both the hard and soft infrastructure required for the private sector to prosper. The kinds of things that private business cannot do, long-term investments that are not profitable in the short term, have to be the responsibility of the government. Now, I can assure you Hamilton wasn't a socialist. It was neither so-called capitalist nor socialist. It was an American system versus the British system. And it was this that made the British fight a revolution, to fight against the American Revolution, and to wage two more wars against the United States, one in the War of 1812 and the Civil War, which was a British-run effort to divide the United States and to retain slavery. And that after the war, after World War II, we basically have watched this British thinking, this British imperial mindset, especially after the killing of Kennedy, take over to the point where you cannot even talk about a sovereign government in Washington today. It's a government by Wall Street, by London and Wall Street. And to a very real extent, Obama's complete subservience to Wall Street was demonstrated yesterday irrefutably by his collaboration with J.P. Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon, in imposing this government guarantee to the gamblers on Wall Street. My video has stopped. Are you hearing me? Can you communicate with me and tell me whether or not I'm still
we can hear you.
On? Okay, fine. So this creditary system is essential. We have a major section in the report goes through this in some detail, both its history and its plan today. What the BRICS are doing is in the direction of this idea of a creditary system. But as you probably know, they're mostly using the tremendous reserves built up in China. And that's fine. Diverting those reserves into building the real economy is essential. But ultimately, we have to move the entire world into a direction away from this monetarism where you effectively have bankers controlling government policies, and towards a restoration of the national banking concept and the creditary system concept, so that governments are able to use their sovereign powers to direct credit into those things necessary for uplifting the productivity of their nation and of the human race, the common aims of mankind generally. The only other thing I want to mention briefly is the so-called extraterrestrial imperative, as our friend Kraft Erika, the great German-American scientist, space scientist, called it. Look at the next slide. Again, the U.S. has given up its manned space program. We've given up most of our space program. We can't even get ourselves to the space station anymore. But the Chinese are moving ahead with India. India just sent a rocket that is circling Mars on its very first effort. This unleashed in India and really around the world the same kind of excitement and enthusiasm that you had in 1963 when we landed, 1968, 1969 when we landed on the moon. I remember that very well. And this is the kind of drive that's necessary not only because we must develop the moon and we must go into the solar system, but because it's essential in the sense that our own development on Earth, we have to get beyond being Earthlings if we're going to succeed in maintaining the pace of development required on Earth. This is a picture of the U-2, the lander that the Russians landed on the moon. And their next round will be planning for the mining of the helium-3. The next slide is the Chinese fusion reactor, the East Tokamak reactor. Again, this is one area, just about the only scientific area where the U.S., under its current sanctions mentality, has not shut down collaboration with the Chinese. There's a bill in the U.S., you may not know this, that it's illegal for U.S. scientists to collaborate with Chinese scientists on space. NASA is not allowed to work with China. Just an insane concept, and yet that's what exists. But on the fusion, they do collaborate, and of course it's urgent that we do away with this insane sanction against collaborating with a country that's actually ahead of us in many ways in the space program. So I'm going to conclude, but I want to say a couple of words first about China's philosophy. I spent many years as a ward of the state studying China. People there can explain that if you wish. But I did a great deal of work comparing Chinese Confucian philosophy and the Western Renaissance. And I think what you're seeing in China today requires understanding this history in China. Helga LaRouche often says that what she finds in Europe and the United States is that people here, even good people, cannot comprehend that China is not driven by geopolitics the way everybody here is. They're not driven by how they're going to benefit at the expense of somebody else, but that they're driven by the idea of the common aims of mankind. And people have become so cynical that even though this was the principle upon which the sovereign nation state was developed and Western civilization grew, it's now almost inconceivable to Americans and Europeans to think that anybody could think that way, let alone the Chinese, and that therefore they must have devious intentions with their development of these great projects and their building of infrastructure worldwide. Well, it's true. They had this horrible cultural revolution from 66 to 76 approximately, a devastating attack on culture, Chinese culture as well as Western culture. It was a true dark age, a fascist kind of era in China. And getting out of that, a major part was opening up to the West, sending thousands and thousands of students around the world to be educated in modern science and technology. But it also was a return to Confucianism. And what Confucius taught back in the 5th century BC, China wasn't united then, it was different kingdoms, and people went around. I'm just going to try to see if I can get the video turned on again here. No, it doesn't seem to work. For some reason I'm not seeing the video. But anyway, he basically went to the various kings who had the so-called mandate of heaven, and he said, okay, you have the so-called mandate of heaven, but if there is want and strife within your kingdom, then that mandate of heaven shall be taken away from you forever. Very much like the American Declaration of Independence. That in fact there is the responsibility of the leader. He's not leader by birth, by military power, if he cannot succeed in building up the society. He talked about what they considered the four fundamental values of the human being. The creative quality of mind, which they called ren, or like agape in the West, righteousness, knowledge, propriety, that these, like Plato, argued that these were born within people, that people were not animals, that they had in them, infused in them, by heaven, these qualities. And as Mencius said later, Mencius, who was the follower of Confucius about a century and a half later, he said, seek these qualities and you will find them, because they're there. But if you neglect them, then you'll lose them. And I think Mencius, the most important thing, I think, is this concept that Mencius laid forth, where he said, you know, in good times, people are generally good. In bad times, people tend to abandon themselves to evil. If circumstances are bad, they allow their minds to become ensnared in evil. And he said that if a people do not have a dependable livelihood, that they tend to turn to depravity and to crime and licentiousness. But then he said, for the government then to turn around and arrest them, that, he said, is entrapment. You are entrapping the people by denying them a livelihood and then punishing them the way you treat animals, with punishments and rewards. This is a very profound thought, and I think it's something we have to think about today, because both on a global scale and domestically, I'm sure you're all watching what's going on in the United States now with this fanning of race war, what happened in Ferguson and in Cleveland and in New York, and Obama fanning race war. So, of course, there is racism coming out with white police killing unarmed black people and so forth. It does reflect it. But where does that come from? Is this something natural in people? Are people naturally racist? No, it's what Mencius said. When you destroy the livelihood of a people, they turn and strike out at the other. Instead of seeing the principle of the other, which is the basis of the sovereign nation state, the idea that our best interests lie in the interests of the other, and the common aims of mankind. Instead of that, you strike out at what appears to be the other, another nation, another religion, another race, and this is what we're experiencing today. There's no question about it. Ferguson, for instance, was a prosperous auto town. There were auto factories, steel factories. People came to Ferguson to get middle-class jobs. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. I worked in the steel mills during the summer in Cleveland. Cleveland is now destitute. All the factories are boarded up. They have nothing except homes that have been foreclosed, thousands of them. They have the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, appealing to bestiality in people's minds instead of to their higher culture through classical music and classical culture. And it's devastating to see what's happening to the American industrial heartland. But this is what causes people to go crazy. How do we defeat that? We defeat it by giving them a sense of hope that there is a real program which can be established, can be and must be established here, and that it's available to us because other nations on earth have adopted what we used to call the American system. And that Helga and Linda LaRouche have, over these last 40 years, through their collaboration with people not only in the United States and in Europe, but in Russia, in China, in India, where Mr. LaRouche has visited many, many times, was a close friend of Indira Gandhi. And I think it's the case, as Mr. LaRouche has said, that Mr. Modi, even though he's from the so-called Hindu party, that he is wearing the mantle of Indira Gandhi, putting religion aside, putting caste aside, and mobilizing the youth in India, and in fact around the world. The speeches he gave in the United States and in Australia just, pulled out hundreds of thousands of viewers from those countries and around the world, inspiring them on what we can do to transform India in collaboration with all nations. With Putin, as I said, is there today. He's very close to the Chinese, and yet he's invited Obama to come and address the National Day this month. And Obama's accepted. And like Xi Jinping's offer to Obama, it basically is saying, you want to exclude us? We do not want to exclude you. We invite you to join us. And that's our responsibility. That's what we in this organization see as our responsibility to convey to Americans, Europeans, and to the world that we have to function as one for the common aims of mankind. That report, which I encourage you to get, the report is available. It's not the small thing you have there. It's a 370-page report, which can be purchased. Well, you can talk to people there. So that's what I had to say, and I'd be glad to hear any comments that you have or questions you may have.
So, yeah, as mentioned, what we've done now is we'll make this audio.
The most cultivated and distant people stretch out their arms to each other. Those in between may gradually be brought to a better way of life. This is precisely the idea that is in effect, the basis of sovereign nation states as developed at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. It's the idea of the interest of the other as being one's own interest. And that concept of uplifting the world as a whole through development is the basis on which we proceed with this effort to deal with this current crisis. Now go on to the fourth slide. This is the map of that's in the current special report. I think you have copies of it there. I hope you do. The back cover of that report has the map that I'm showing you on the screen. There's two aspects to what we're going through in this Landbridge idea, the Silk Road idea. One is the corridors that I've described, the other being links, linking parts of the world that have not been linked in the past. And I want to just quickly review a few of them while we're looking at that large map. The first is the Bering Strait, and somebody there might want to point them out in the map if it's convenient. The idea of building a tunnel under the Bering Strait, connecting the United States and Russia, has been around for a very long time, but it became a very serious effort in the 19th and South American continents, so that you could actually take a rail from the southern tip of Argentina through South America, through Central America, through the United States, through Canada, to Alaska, to Russia, to China, to Europe, to the Middle East, into Africa, and down to the tip of Africa when we succeed in building the necessary railroads in Africa. So these are the kind of great projects that we're talking about. Now there's many more. I'm not going to go through them now for a matter of time. But for instance, we could connect Japan to the mainland both through bridges to go from northern Japan into the Sakhalin Islands and across from the Sakhalin Island to the mainland Russia. We could connect Japan to Korea on the southern tip of Japan. This would integrate Japan directly into the Eurasian development, facilitating Japan, Korea, China, Russia, and Mongolia working together on the development of the Russian Far East and the Tumen River area, the Yalu River area, which is one of the things we cover in the report at some length as not only absolutely essential and valuable, but something which is really the only way of ending the crisis with North Korea and giving North Korea a stake in rail and oil development in that region. This is now being pursued by South Korea and Russia, and to a certain extent with China involved. There's also, in Europe, we could and must build a 90s. The Russians called a conference in Moscow on building a tunnel under the Bering Strait. Mr. LaRouche gave a keynote speech at that conference. He's seen as the architect of this concept of the global land bridge, and in particular, linking the United States and Russia by rail. And at that conference, Mr. Putin said that this is a war avoidance policy, because the effort to demonize Russia at that time was already beginning in a serious way. And he said, correctly, that were we to work with the United States on our actual mutual self-interests and the development of the entire Russian Far East and the Alaska, Canada, area that now is vastly underdeveloped. This would be a basis for overcoming the kind of manipulated antagonisms and so-called contradictions between them. Now, if you take the rail connection from the United States up to the Bering Strait, which of course would mean developing that entire region through this development corridor idea, and follow that down south through Mexico, through Central America, you're going to come to what's called the Darien Gap. And this is a stretch of about 100 kilometers in Colombia, which is marshland and which has never been connected by either road or rail. And it's, again, something that's been on the board for a long time. It's now imminently feasible, and it's a basis on which we can and must connect the North. What you can see is Eurasia. It's based on what I was just discussing, this idea of linking Europe and the Pacific through high-speed rail connections and through development corridors, not just connecting the two ends, but using that as a basis for developing nuclear-powered cities, water projects, energy products, industrial cities along the way, uplifting Central Asia and rebuilding the Russian Far East, as well as expanding trade and collaboration internationally. Now, this was based on a principle that's not new. Go to the third slide. This is Gottfried Leibniz, the great German philosopher, scientist, economist from the 17th and 18th century, who in a sense is the mentor of Mr. LaRouche. And he was in collaboration with the Jesuit missionaries who were in China at the time and began a publication called Novissima Sinica, the news from China in Europe, in which he said, and I'll read what's on the screen there, he said, "I consider it a singular plan of the fates that human cultivation and refinement should today be concentrated, as it were, in the two extremes of our continent, in Europe and in China, which adorns the Orient as Europe does the opposite edge of the earth. Perhaps supreme providence has ordained such an arrangement so that as a tunnel under the Mediterranean connecting Spain and Tunisia as a basis of bringing Northern Africa and Europe together through rail." So these are the kind of links that are possible. In terms of the development corridors, we know about the Silk Road. You see the Silk Road process there on the maps. If you look at the blue line, that's known as what Xi Jinping called for as the Maritime Silk Road. Reopening the path that was taken by the great 14th and 15th century Chinese admiral Cheng He, who had the great treasure ships at the time of Columbus, but ships that were 3 times bigger than anything Columbus had in discovering America, which were traveling through the Malacca Straits, into the Indian Ocean, into the Persian Gulf, down the coast of Africa to Madagascar. And Xi Jinping, in his speech in Indonesia last year, proposed reopening this maritime Silk Road. He met with Dr. Mahathir in Malaysia, and they formed the Cheng He Foundation to foster this idea of the Maritime Silk Road. And China has allotted an extra $20 billion fund for that development, along with their $40 billion fund for the Silk Road in Central Asia, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank $100 billion fund, along with the